Welcome to Kazimierz. We are standing in a very symbolic place, a place which is marking the very beginnings of Jewish settlement here. In the heart of the Jewish district of Kazimierz, in Wolnica Square, which used to be the main market square of this district. It used to be as large as the market square of Krakow itself. Later on it was built over because such a large space was not needed. In the base of the building, which was built as the city hall for the separate city of Kazimierz in the medieval time period, there is a plaque. And the plaque is marking the legendary or true reception of the Polish Jews into the Kingdom of Poland sometime in the 1300s. Of course, the legend has it that the king for the reception of Jews on those areas was King Kazimierz the Great, so that would take us into 1300s. But obviously we know that the Jewish residents in Krakow were already having their institutions as early as 1200s. That first Jewish community was in the very city center, in the district which is right now the University district. Only in 1400s they had to move into Kazimierz.
Krakow, a city 1,000 years old in the south of Poland. In Jewish tradition, it is called Kraków. From 1138, Krakow was the capital of the kings of Poland. They established their residence in the glorious Wawel Palace, which dominates the entire city. The famous Cathedral of Wawel. Here are interred Poland's kings, her national heroes, and poets. These is the Church of St. Mary, built in the Gothic style. Its towers all of different heights. Every hour, a trumpet blast is sounded from the top tower. This trumpet blast is also broadcast daily at noon throughout Poland. In 1495, the Jews were expelled from their homes and went to live in the village of Kazimierz, not far from Krakow. Until the middle of the 19th century, the Jews of Krakow continued to live in cramped quarters in Kazimierz, which became the Jewish ghetto of Krakow. In the 19th century, the village became a part of Krakow. And from 1867, Jews were again permitted to live in any part of Greater Krakow. Nevertheless, a considerable portion of the Jewish population, which numbers 60,000 souls, lives to this day in Kazimierz, which the Jews call Kuzmin.
Behind me is the magnificent building of a 1400s Old Synagogue, which was stylized a little bit like Germanic synagogues built in Erfurt or Worms in the mostly Rhine River. Those communities have to flee because of growing anti-Semitism and also crusaders invading more and more often minority communities in Europe. In early 1400s there is a large influx of Jews from Prague coming to Kazimierz, coming to Krakow. Crusades very often were limiting themselves into plunder, attack and destruction of the minority communities in Europe, more than reaching the target of Jerusalem ever. Behind me is the already legendary Szeroka Street, the Broadway. When we talk about the beginnings of the city, and every city starts with the decision about the size and shape of a market square. Yes, the cities were nothing more in medieval times as large merchandising centers on the convenient crossroads. So every city starts with shaping of a market square. In case of Kazimierz, there are a couple of those squares. There's definitely Wolnica Square, which is taking more of a rectangular form. But Szeroka Street, the Broadway, from pretty much 1300s up until World War II, remained a major Jewish market square in the district of Kazimierz. Exploring the district today, you can find still a lot of relics. Well, pretty much physically the entire district survived, which is one of the miracles here. But within those relics and sometimes dilapidating buildings, which are proudly resisting the progressing gentrification of the last 30 years, yes, it's actually the European reality. Whenever you look into whichever former Jewish district in any European country, the reality is that all of those which are still having any remnants were going through a massive gentrification over the last 20-30 years in particular, becoming chic, residential, and sometimes extremely expensive. At the same time, became, particularly in summer, very crowded with tourists and visitors. But somewhere within this modern glam surface over those districts, you can still find the relics, you can still find somewhere on the outskirts the survivors in form of surviving architecture. You can still find a little bit more genuine and original structures which are proudly resisting this new trend and this new idea of changing it into something in between being fashionable and being actually commercialized, because this is what those districts are sometimes reduced at the end of the day. Talking about those remnants and those things which are still remaining in Kazimierz, if you look carefully enough, you can come across still hundreds of the traces after mezuzot. Kazimierz is known for a lot of non-obvious places, and we are standing at a very non-obvious and a complicated intersection of streets. So this is an intersection of Bożego Ciała, which goes as Corpus Christi Street, with an outstanding Rabbi Street, because the intersecting street is Rabbi Meisel's, a very famous religious but also political leader of Polish Jewry in 1800s. One of the buildings that is standing here before the war was called Hevratilim, so the Psalmist Society, a society which was religious because the building had a synagogue in the ground floor, but it also had a cultural association which was taking the upper part of the building, and that's right now the building behind me. Well, after the war, obviously it was abandoned and nationalized. All of the painted walls with synagogal paintings and polychromes were covered with wooden shingles. The building was claimed back by the Jewish community based on the Jewish communal property restitution law from late 90s. Then it was very poorly rented into the private hands of a man who was running a heavy metal disco club in it. Whether anything like a heavy metal disco club exists? Well, yes, it existed in Kazimierz for a short time. The owner of this establishment removed the wooden shingles, and to everybody's surprise, underneath the shingles there were polychromes of Western Wall, of Rachel's grave, and also Hebrew paintings and prayers. Over the last few years, the building is rented again into private hands. It's right now having a cafeteria and a cultural center called Hevre, which is obviously a slightly better usage of a historical space. This takes us into a fascinating and a very important question which needs to be debated about what shall we do with heritage sites, about what is the level of preservation and for what reasons do we preserve, and what is the level of commercial usage and how do we commercially use the sites which are still marking and are the traces of the civilization of Polish Jewry and Krakow Jewry. Just to remind you, 64,000 of Jews before the war in Krakow, servicing about 7 established synagogues and a couple of hundreds of shtibels, smaller prayer houses all around the city.
The Altashul, a synagogue built in the 14th century in the shape of a fortress, the oldest synagogue in Poland. A synagogue built in the 16th century bears the name of the Rima, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, one of the great codifiers in the history of Judaism. Here he composed the Mappa, or the tablecloth, to complement the Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Yosef Karo from Safed, and to adapt it to the customs of Ashkenazi Jewry.
Welcome to the Rima Jewish Cemetery in Krakow, one of the oldest Jewish cemeteries in this part of the world, among the oldest in Europe, that's for sure. It dates back to the first half of 1500s and is named after an outstanding Talmudic scholar, Moshe Isserles, better known by the first letters taken from his writings, creating an acronym of Rima. Such is the name of the cemetery itself, and such is the name of the adjacent synagogue. The synagogue, interestingly enough, was built based on the private property belonging to the father of Moshe Isserles. In the excavations of the last 5 years, we've actually unearthed a warehouse, because the father of Moshe Isserles was a pretty outstanding and successful merchant in his times. But returning to Moshe Isserles himself, he studied in Lublin, in the famous Lublin Yeshiva under Shalom Shachna. He returned to Krakow somewhere around mid-1500s and became the renowned, one of the best known European legal authorities on interpretation of Talmud and Torah. The Treaty of Moshe Isserles is a folio of Ashkenazi interpretations on top of Yosef Skaro Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch translates as the set table, so the set table of Jewish halachic laws that every Sephardi, because Yosef Karo was a Sephardi Jewish family, would use on the daily basis. There was a problem of using this Yosef Karo Shulchan Aruch, also 1500s interpretation, by the Ashkenazi Jews up north. And here comes Moshe Isserles. Here comes the Rima rabbi. He have created an Ashkenazi interpretation and an Ashkenazi folio of legal interpretation on top of Shulchan Aruch. Moshe Isserles is obviously also buried here. So right behind me there is a grave of Moshe Isserles which survived, and he is buried along his closest family members. When you look around this very cemetery, you can see that quite a lot of stones are having characteristic Renaissance Italian ornamentation. Well, quite a lot of the stones were unearthed in the after World War II excavations. and brought back to the surface in order to be shown as a cemetery. The cemetery itself during World War II was very badly destroyed by the Nazis. It was actually changed into a rubbish dump, and most of the stones were missing after the war finished. So in the 50s, the cemetery was re-restored in the course of excavation, which in itself was highly controversial. But because of those excavations, we can see the stones from 1500s.
The old cemetery next to the synagogue named after the Rima. Here are buried great rabbis of the period. Rabbi Yom Tov Lipman Heller, the great Talmudist Rabbi Yaakov Polak, the Kabbalist Rabbi Natan Neta Shapira, and many others. On Lag BaOmer, the anniversary of the Rima's death, thousands of Jews come from all over Poland to prostrate themselves upon his grave.
Welcome to Plac Nowy. Before the war it was named a Jewish square for a reason. This was one of the few places in which the fate of Christian inhabitants of Krakow and the fate of Jewish inhabitants of Krakow would intersect. Yes, for centuries it was trading. It was trading where the lives of Christians, Jews, and also all kinds of other minorities inhabiting Poland and inhabiting Krakow would intersect. This was the place of gossip, this was the place of small talk, this was the place of getting to know each other. This was a place of building a very important social cohesion, or I would say a very important social security fuse in you can get exposed to the other, in which you can actually have a conversation, you can see a human being in this other who otherwise might be pictured within the framework of your religion as the different, as the dangerous, as the one that you shall stay away from, as the one you shall not interact, God forbid intermarry. So economy historically had a very important function in getting people exposed to each other, and in this way intersecting and intertwining people's faiths.
There are many synagogues in Krakow, and they recall days of glory as well as days of massacre and heroism. The Kupashul, the Popper, and the tall synagogue, where the prayer hall has been built on the top floor for security reasons.
So within the 700 years of Jewish presence in Kazimierz, a lot of things have changed. And the Krakow Jews, but also Judaism as such, is absolutely following those changes. Particularly 17th, 18th, 1900s were speeding up social, religious, but also architectonical changes, political changes within the Krakow Jewish community. Here we are in front of one of the last established large grand synagogues of Kazimierz. This is the great temple synagogue which was built in 1860s, and this was built for the community which from early 1800s, taking the example from the Jewish communities in Germany and Vienna. Just to remind you, Krakow at that time is the part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and one of the cities of Galicia. So those Krakow Jews are believing that the future is in Neology Judaism, as they were calling it. The future is in trying to adapt into the life as it changes outside the Jewish community. To adapt a little bit to modernity, to accept the fact that we can abandon certain part of orthodoxy for the sake of being admitted into the Christian world. This is also a part of a decision and a mode of how to evade anti-Semitism, which was recurrently coming into the surface. So philosophically it is a belief that when we adapt, when we abandon certain parts of orthodoxy, we will be accepted. Yeah? We will live and will contribute to the city itself, to the academia, to the medical system, legal system, and so on. So as much as the history of Krakow Jewry is hidden and confined within all of those traces that we are following, the traces of architecture, the traces of mezuzot, the traces of buildings which are still there and used to be Jewish or Jewish institutions, the future of Jewish community in Krakow is confined within one building, which is standing in Kazimierz for over 10 years. Interestingly enough, it's one of the very few modern architectonical additions into the Kazimierz district. And this is the 10 years in existence building of JCC. But the building is not enough. A JCC is much more than just a building. The JCC is about an institution that fills this building and people that are making JCC. And over the last over 10 years, there's a tremendous growth of Jewish life, Jewish presence, looking for Jewish families and Jewish heritage, establishing the elderly club and the club for the survivors, which is offering all kinds of assistance, from kosher food through rehabilitation into trips into Israel. But also, for the last couple of years, something gearing more towards the future within this building is a kindergarten.
Educational institutions maintained by the Jews of Krakow. The Hebrew language is also taught in other schools. The Mizrahi, the Tachkimoni, the Beit Yaakov, in the Ort and the Ognisko trade schools, in the commercial high schools, and of course in the cheters and yeshivas of Kazimierz.
There are a few reasons why Kazimierz is so unique and brings so many people from all over the world. First of all, it has not been destroyed. So what we have here is the original fabric of the town that was created throughout the centuries. So that's one unique feature, that whatever you see here, this is pretty much unique and original. Second of all, Kazimierz history is unique. It was created, a part of it was created as a Jewish town. So we know that in the history, usually the story is that there are towns and cities where the Jews are not allowed to settle. In Kazimierz, the story was very different. It was the part of the city where Christians were not allowed to settle by the orders of the king. So the space that was uniquely created for the Jews was created here when the Jews were expelled from, especially in the end of 15th century, expelled from the city of Krakow.
So certainly this uniqueness of Kazimierz is on various layers and various levels, and whether you look at the history or contemporary situation, you see the diversity, and I think this is one of the elements that survive from the ancient or medieval times, the coexistence of various groups in Kazimierz, the coexistence of various cultures, but primarily Jews and Christians living together in this district. And I think this coexistence, historical one, has some continuity today. We see a lot of diversity and much more, I would say, tolerance and openness to other groups than just the majority living here. So this is one thing. When you look at the Jewish heritage here, certainly Kazimierz was unique because of being Ashkenazi Jewish life center, and this is something that made it unique in the so-called Golden Age in the 16th and 17th century. But today we see both intellectual and material heritage of this golden period, which is to some extent carried on by the community in the later period, but to some extent it's also forgotten or maybe not appreciated enough.
So after the war, the district was derelict, pretty much deprived of its pre-war population, and it started to be deliberately settled by all kinds of people who are, let's call it, social outcasts. So all kinds of people who are problematic for the new communist authority were being settled in Kazimierz. This Kazimierz is becoming one of the most neglected and at the same time dangerous districts of Krakow through the 60s, 70s, into the 80s. It was only in the 90s when a certain revival comes in, when the eyes of the world, the eyes of Poland itself, are turning back to Kazimierz again, and it comes at the day and time of a certain return of memory of a Jewish community that once lived here, but also return of memory about the Holocaust. Kazimierz is a topic again, largely thanks to the film industry. Yes, it was in the early 90s, exactly 1992, when the large filming crew appears in Krakow and starts to shoot the scenes for the Schindler's List. We are standing in one of the places that was used as a scenery a couple of times in the movie, and in such way became immortalized and iconic by being shown on the Schindler's List. In such way also became the tourist attraction. Yes, very often people visiting Kazimierz those days are more interested in the sites and places which are secondarily created to be famous by the film industry, rather than exploring the original prime history that happened here. Or maybe those places that are secondarily reproduced on the films are helping the visitors and helping the tourists to return mentally and memory-wise to the people that lived in Kazimierz pretty much from medieval time period all the way into 1942 and 3.